Broadcasting live from the Business RadioX studios in Phoenix, Arizona, it's time for Phoenix Business Radio, spotlighting the city's best businesses and the people who lead them.
Hello and welcome to Phoenix Business Radio, broadcasting live from the Max 6 Entrepreneurial Center right here in Tempe, Arizona, where we help build businesses and connect you with the right people. And we are certainly doing that today. I have been spending only the last 10 minutes with Neal Lester, who is with Project Humanities at ASU. And I'm telling you, you are in for a treat. I know I am. We are just now getting to get acquainted with each other. And wow, welcome to the studio.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Yes, very excited to have you. And we have our friend Randy Ortiz to thank for the introduction.
Great connector.
Such a great connector.
Yeah, and a human being, too.
I was just going to say the same thing. So shout out
Thank
to
you,
Randy. Yes. When we have an opportunity to have him listen, he was very excited about the introduction. I think it came through social media, and you and we just had already admitted we're not on there a lot, although at least in my world it appears that I am. And it took a couple nudges from Randy to get me to respond. So thank you for...
I thought you came through pretty quickly.
Oh, I hope so. I'm glad.
Yes, no, it was like, there's interest there.
For sure. Once I knew that you were out there and the introduction was there, of course it made sense. Sometimes I'm just delayed.
Okay. Well, I didn't feel that at all, so thank you.
I'm so glad. So, yes. Neal, we've got plenty of time to talk about your professional journey, why it's so important to you, your role at ASU, and then really as the founding director for Project Humanities, what is all that all about? So let's start with that. Okay. Tell us who and what Project Humanities is. And then I would love to get to the backstory, and we'll go there eventually.
Well, I am flattered that you have invited me on to talk about Project Humanities in the context of business, because I never quite think of it that way. Although I do think of Project Humanities in terms of being entrepreneurial, and that entrepreneurial can move outside the typical spaces that that I associate with business. So thank you for that. Project Humanities is a university initiative that is multiple award-winning, and that's important not just for the sake of the awards, but because there are lots of diverse communities that see the value and impact of what we do. We bring individuals and communities together to talk, listen, and connect. We try to offer a little TLC, and that can be in various formats, from film screenings and discussions to lectures to presentations, performances. But the idea is, how do you get people to do things that they ordinarily wouldn't do in a space that feels safe, but also that gets people not only to think in terms of how they're living their lives, but how we might be better at living our lives with each other.
How would you define?
It's a tall order.
It is a tall order. And again...
But it's worked for 13 years, though.
Has it already been 13 years?
It's been 13 years, and it's working, and we're still evolving and also learning. So this is not so much about being in the sort of ivory tower of university space and then going out to sort of educate people. We are really about being educated, but also learning together and establishing community, especially at a time when people seem so divided.
Mm-hmm. How would you define humanities?
Humanities is the study of how humans connect. And we do that in many ways. And I think that for many people, particularly academics, we can get caught up in trying to define things. We prefer to define things by doing it and then naming it, but recognizing that names don't always help. Sometimes they also limit. I'm thinking of a song by Ashford and Simpson that says, "Don't give it a name. The moment you do, it flees from you." And for me, that means that's why we have all those definitions, the dictionary definitions of, the 1, the 2, the 3, the A, the B. So I say you do it. So we don't talk about what it means to be human. We prefer to talk about how are we human. And we sort of undergird those with principles we call Humanity 101.
Would you say that part of it is also not only how are we human, is it also how do we feel about it?
I'm not so much into feeling.
Oh, okay. I'm excited.
I'm a Judge Judy fan in that regard, because we can't really challenge how we feel. We can certainly legitimize feelings, but we want people to be engaged on levels that involve both feeling but also critical thinking. And critical thinking isn't necessarily feeling. When I'm in class and I'm talking, because I'm also a faculty member who writes books and does service, I can't really guide a conversation or participate in a conversation if people lead with how they feel. because feelings and beliefs can't really be challenged. But if the classroom is a space for engagement, then we can talk about ideas. And I'm not delegitimizing one's feelings because we all have them. But in terms of a critical engagement, that's what we try to bring. And if feeling happens to come up, that can go in multiple directions
Well, and I'm
that
going
could
to,
benefit or shut down a conversation, how people
yes.
feel.
And I'm going to assert, just
Yes,
based on my experience, that feelings are going to show up.
yes,
And so how do we make, perhaps it's an invitation to engage and navigate and
right,
explore how we're feeling as we're
right,
having these conversations. And so yeah,
right.
I love it.
Well, the thing about the feelings, and I think about this, and once something has been triggered and you feel that, there's no way for us to unfeel that. The question is, what do we do with that feeling, whether we express that feeling or not? So, with our critical conversations, we give topics, and our objective is not to see how people feel, but to get people to acknowledge something, be that a feeling or rethinking about something or reframing of something or having an aha moment, which may not be about a feeling. So I'm not delegitimizing feeling. We're just not leading with feeling,
Yeah.
because touching, talking, listening, and connecting is a way of touching people in different ways. And I
Yeah.
don't mean physically touching,
Yeah.
although
Yeah, of
that
course.
has its place as well.
Yeah. Okay. I really am grateful for that introduction. Where did the idea for you as founding director for
Yes.
Project Humanities come about?
Well, I've been at ASU for a very long time. I say this jokingly that I came in 1997. And so when I'm talking to my students and they say, "Well, how long have you been here?" I say, "Well, I came here in the 1900s." And for them, that's pretty funny. What's interesting to me is that when I came as a faculty member, as a professor of English from the University of Alabama. So I've always been an English professor teaching literature and African American literature and culture in particular. But when I got here, I dabbled in some administrative positions. I became chair of the English department, which at the time was the largest in the department and the most complicated. So that was interesting. That's also interesting that I become professor of the year. And as soon as I became professor of the year, then I was sort of invited into administration, taking me out of the classroom. So you may know a little bit about that as a former administrator. But moving from the Department of English chair, I then was appointed the Dean of Humanities. And that was at a time when there was an economic downturn that had people fleeing from humanities majors. And so, anytime there's sort of an economic downturn, and we may be experiencing one now, the question that comes to folks who are in college, particularly from people who are financing that, is what are you going to do with that? And maybe that's a perennial question that English has always, what are you going to do with an English major? As though having a major means you have to do something with it. And as other colleges, universities were cutting humanities courses and degrees, President Crow came to me and said, let's make humanities more robust. And I took that kind of big, loose assignment to be one that allows me to sort of communicate with stakeholders why and how humanities is important, and to move that conversation beyond classrooms and disciplines. Because even though we talk about higher education and education generally being a great equalizer, it really isn't. People don't always get into college. We get into universities because of grades and transcripts and all these things.
Mhm.
And even within those classrooms, we have A's, B's, C's, you're number one. And so that kind of competition wasn't particularly interesting to me in terms of trying to engage stakeholders who could be parents, who could be aunts and uncles, who could be community members, who could be people who don't have degrees. So the
Mhm.
idea is, how do you find those common places where people aren't spoken down to, but are invited into conversations? And so the idea started initially, we were going to have conversations about a topic, and the topic was place, perspectives on place, because that was one of President Crow's interests at the time, is how do we get people to see the Southwest as a place of excellence beyond the Northeast and the West Coast. Because when we talk about where are those pockets of excellence, there's the Ivies over
Yeah.
there, and there's the Ivy adjacents over here. But what happens in the Southwest? So I invited these people from multiple disciplines and professions to talk about place. And it was so interesting to have scientists and engineers and community members and students and faculty talking about place from multiple perspectives that we sort of decided, well, let's do this a whole semester and not just a week. And then the week became a semester, and the semester became a year, and then it became an academic year, and now it's a calendar year. And so it has evolved in terms of how we do the programs, but also the kinds of programs that we do.
I have the benefit of having seen, and of course, we'll share it in the show notes, some of the topics that you've had conversations around. I'm happy to read some of them because I was blown away and would love to be in those
And that's a
conversations.
random sampling.
Oh my
I mean,
goodness. So yeah,
13 years.
menstrual equity, banned books, inclusive bathrooms, and fear of diversity, white women dismantling white supremacy, history of HBCUs.
Yes, historically Black colleges and universities.
Okay. Indigenous rock music, social justice beyond books through things and stuff, dispelling myths about beauty queens, dispelling myths about drag kings and queens, food and identity, schism.
Sikhism.
Okay, what is that? 101.
Sikhism. We have people on our staff who have various interests and degrees, and one was at the time religious studies, and so we were having these interfaith conversations. And too often we have conversations that only center a couple of faith systems, and
Yeah.
so this was a way of looking at another faith system that's often confused with Muslim faith.
And is that what Sikhism is?
Well, it
An
not
offshoot of it?
is, but
Uh-huh.
it's people get those confused.
Okay.
And particularly after 9/11, one of the first persons who was killed at a service station here was somebody who was Sikh, and people thought the person was Muslim because they were wearing
I
a hat.
remember.
Yes.
Okay.
So we want, and what's interesting about that is that came to us from two Sikh doctors from Scottsdale who knew that Project Humanities brings people together, talk, listen, and connect, and said, I'd love to do a series on Sikhism. And we called it Sikhism 101. And the idea is that we went to one of the places where Sikhs worship, and we had a conversation that was intergenerational. It was broadcast around the world. We had a meal right after, which was part of the tradition too, but it started to get us to see that maybe we're more aligned and connected than we think we are. We're just in different lanes on the same highway trying to get to the same place
Right.
relative to humanity.
Yeah. Powerful. I would love to just read these last couple. Again, these are a small sampling, but I'm also trying to read through tears, to be honest with you. Body positivity, modern day voter suppression, body neutrality, Black parenting and spanking, parenting across cultures, youth mental health, really can't see through tears, and academic pressures, harm reduction, birth justice, and radical MLK.
Yeah.
Again, just a super small sampling from 2011 when
Yes.
this is founded. And
Yes.
this is all around conversations
Yes.
to help open people up
Right.
and stay curious.
And ourselves, because these topics come from places that we have curiosities about. We also try to keep our fingers on the pulse of what's happening in the world. So that one in particular about white women dismantling white supremacy actually came as a result of the George Floyd murder in May 2020. And people were having conversations about a lot of things, but they weren't having conversations about, and even though white women weren't central in that in what happened to George Floyd, as far as we know, it allowed us to talk about systemic racism and quote unquote white supremacy, or the illusion of white supremacy, in many, many ways.
Mhm.
And white women had been the subject of conversation in the 2016 election, and this whole notion of when we talk about whiteness, we have to make sure that that is intersectional, that we're talking about gender, we're talking about class, we're talking about all kinds of things. And so that came out of that. And it was actually facilitated by a white woman with a panelist of white women. So this notion of how do you dismantle systemic racism is that white people need to talk to white people, and I have, as a faculty member who is an expert for some, have been called many a time to sort of give an answer to why systemic racism is here and how to get it fixed. Well, I don't have a magic potion for that. The only thing I can suggest is that people need to talk amongst themselves, those who have created it and those who perpetuate it. And that sometimes is radical for folks. Said I'm a nice person.
Yeah. And to me, it's a yes and. It's a yes. Those conversations need to happen with each other.
Yes.
However,
Mhm.
is part of the challenge that when we only talk to people who look like us, have had similar upbringings, live
Hmm.
in a similar neighborhood,
Hmm.
whatever,
Hmm.
if we're not inclusive
Hmm.
and find diversity, then perhaps we're stuck in having the same conversations that are not benefiting us.
Well, I would caveat that and say you can't talk to the same people whose ideas and values mirror yours. There has to be accountability there. So you can't surround yourself with people who just say yes to everything you do. I mentioned earlier that I have a very socially conscious family member who is continually reminding me of things, and that's good for me. It's not always comfortable, but it's good for me. What was happening at the time is that George Floyd, and other things that happened prior to George Floyd and have happened since, but there was this sense of let's have a lunch and learn. Let's have a listen session and tell me about your trauma. What is it like to be X in the academy? What is it like to be a black? And those kinds of conversations were not necessarily productive. So what I mean by that is, first of all, I don't have a bullet for this. I don't mean to use that. No intention about the bullet. The people who create the systems and perpetuate it can't solve it.
Mhm,
And that can also transfer beyond race. So
mhm.
sexism, misogyny, women didn't create that. Women may be perpetuating, but they didn't create that. The LGBTQ two spirits didn't create the anti-queerness. Straight people need to. So that's what I mean when I say that.
I love
Surround
it.
your people by people who will hold you accountable, not people who just say yes. And that's not always what leadership does.
Which goes back to your observation around how cool it is. I'll use the word cool, you
Okay.
didn't,
Okay.
to be on a business podcast
Yes.
because the conversation really, I believe, needs to bleed into our
Right.
businesses,
Right.
not only higher ed,
Right.
education all around, our communities, our churches,
Right.
our backyard barbecues,
Yes.
and our businesses, small business, all the way on up through enterprise.
Well, I'm glad you said that because that really does frame it clearer because Project Humanities has always been connected with businesses. In
How is
fact,
that?
well, we have an annual, one example is we have an annual Hacks for Humanity, which is, it seems like it's a tech event, but it really is bigger than a tech event. So those people who come in every October, again, talking, listening, connecting, is people come in from different generations, professions, and communities, and they build a solution to a problem. And tech is just one part of that. So people who come in who are in that sort of space where they are always wanting to, go from place to place to code, this is more than coding. So the idea is that you come in and we will give you a topic, not a thesis, and then a group of random people will be assigned to a team and they will create the technology. And what we really want is to show that we are better together than we can create anything. And so the corporate support has come from State Farm. The corporate support has come from Silicon Valley Bank. The corporate support has come from ADP. And not only have they supported that, but they've also participated as volunteers and mentors. With our homeless outreach, we have lots and lots of corporate organizations who volunteer with us, whether they're sorting up here every Friday or going down to the what used to be the Human Services campus in downtown Phoenix as volunteers for those clients. So we have always had conversations with folks outside, but I also like to think of this in terms of being entrepreneurial. I'm one of the few, I think, who tries to think of my humanities experience as an entrepreneur. And I sort of learned this from President Crow that entrepreneurship is about new ideas, new resources, new audiences, whatever you haven't been doing. Now, the nuance part of that is it may be new to us, but it may not be new to other people. And I think what Project Humanities is doing, it's not beyond thinking. I know that what we are doing is unique because no other universities are sort of engaged in the same way that we are. Relative to being just fundamentally socially embedded. And part of being socially embedded is connecting with these community corporate partners and others.
You spoke about stakeholders earlier,
Yes.
and you also, when you came into the studio, made a comment
Yes.
about conscious
Conscious capitalism.
capitalism,
Mhm.
and really that is what's so critical and runs through not only the Max Six community, the building, and the community in which I have the studio. Also, the whole reason behind Phoenix Business Radio X is that your story matters, and these conversations are better shared when people have access to it, which is why you do it through podcasting.
Right.
And that stakeholders, right? It's community, it's the vendor, it's the client or the customer, it's the employee or the teammate sitting next to you, it's upper management, lower management, it's everything. And the passion and the purpose that you serve, how can it be a win, 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 win for everyone?
Right.
And also economically help shift the vibration for everybody, especially those community members who
Right.
may have not had the same advantages.
Well, I'm looking at your tagline, building business, connecting people, and it just embodies what we do. We talking, listening, connecting. We lead with people first. That's one of the lessons that we learned
Mhm.
as we do our outreach to now over 250 clients and who are unsheltered, is that we try to get people to think about what we say, because what we say reflects often how we think or don't think. And so at one point, some of our volunteers were saying, oh, homeless people, homeless people, homeless people. We said, well, let's lead with people first. Let's say people experiencing homelessness, so that homelessness is not perceived as an identity, but rather a circumstance that any one of us could be flirting with at any moment.
I have two introductions for you and probably more. When you talk about the October event, Hacks for
Yes.
Humanities, one of the show.
Humanity.
Oh, so
Humanity.
Hacks for
I know,
Humanity.
yeah, humanity,
Okay.
because we have
Yeah.
these Humanity 101 values, and part of this was to be a thread pulling these seemingly disparate things together. And so we thought, well, let's frame it around humanity. And
Just
the
like
thing,
you said a moment ago, it's people.
it's people. It's people. And
Yeah,
so
not homeless people. It's
that's right.
people
It's people
first.
experiencing homelessness. And so we've come up with what we call these 7 principles: compassion, empathy, forgiveness, integrity, kindness, respect, and self reflection. And we don't define those for people because we know that they exist across cultures. And what we have since May 2020 and George Floyd's murder is connected those with both diversity and justice. And even Dr. King, in one of the speeches that no one reads called The Other America, and I invite people to read it, 1967, he delivered it at Stanford University. He says large segments of society, at the time he says white society, but we have opened that to say large segments of society are satisfied with tranquility in the status quo. But in order to value, center humanity and justice, we have to disrupt that tranquility. And that's what Project Humanities is doing. And when we stop and focus on people instead of this notion of what we have accomplished and how many awards we have and are we number one and what is our ranking, then we can focus on community and sharing, and not necessarily getting lost in capitalism that is not conscious, shall we say.
Yes. So often people say that
Yes.
conscious capitalism are two words that should not exist in not even the same sentence, let alone the same phrase. And it's paramount that it
Yes.
be just that.
Well, and those organizations can happen. It doesn't have
Yes.
to be an either or. And we tell people that in our hackathon, we call it a hackathon. It's called Hacks for Humanity, Hacking for the Social Good. And it means that this is not about finding your car in a parking lot, which could be very important, but it's about something bigger than that.
Mhm.
And once these teams have been put together on Friday night, it's 36 hours. It's like a giant slumber party with corporate support. That these teams come together. They are mentored. They're taught how to do a business plan. They are taught how to do a pitch. They're taught how to do a website. And at the end of this, it's a competition. And the competition is about humanity, though. And what happens more often than not is that these teams have developed something beyond the hackathon. And so there's networking, there are friendships, there are things that go beyond whether your product won or not. And then we have supporters who give out little things that we offer as raffles during it. So it really is about how do you build community in a space that ordinarily wouldn't come together.
It's life-changing.
And it has been for us, particularly for me as a humanities person who is not in that space. But what I recognize is I have something to contribute to that I may not be doing it, but I'm certainly facilitating it. And that's how I see Project Humanities more broadly. We're facilitating things and hoping that seeds are planted that we may or may not see immediately before us.
Would you say that the Hacks for Humanity and your work to help homeless here in
We would say support.
support
rather
to help
because
support or
feels
to
hierarchical.
Yep. Okay. Perfect. I love the corrections.
Well, I don't mean it's
No,
not,
no, no, no.
it's-
I'm welcoming it, and it needs to be. I'm fine with that. I shared with you earlier that for it was probably I want to say 2018, 2019 into
Right.
2020, we did this beautiful series called
Right.
Racism in Small Business and
Yes.
the Arts.
Yes.
And I co-hosted that with two other women, and we had authors and speakers and business owners and leaders on in these deep conversations, and I learned so much. And
Right.
again, I'm naive. I bring a bias that sometimes I'm aware of and other times I'm not even aware
Right.
of. And so I'm appreciative when someone redirects me.
Well, I'm learning stuff and I have to make sure that I'm not doing that inappropriately. But that's one of the things we had to talk about because there's a way in which doing the outreach can feel a little saviorish that we are going down and helping people who can't help themselves. And so if we support them, then we don't have to bring in that notion of helping. I'm helping you. And so much of poverty porn, for example, that's a topic that we've also dealt with and I've learned personally about because we would do that 10 years ago. We would go down and take pictures of people in tents and people sleeping on sidewalks and post those
I,
pictures and say, "Oh, come down and volunteer." And some of the volunteers were saying, "Oh, if you really want to feel good about your life, come down and see this." And I was like, "Okay, let's reframe that."
it really got,
So
yeah,
that's where that
it
came
got
from.
weird, didn't it?
That's what that's
Look at
what
me
came.
doing good.
Yes.
Yes.
And
And I've been, I mean, I
say it.
myself have found myself down that trap and have caught myself, and or other people have caught
Yes.
me and helped
Yeah.
me redirect.
So the stuff that I'm doing is stuff that I've learned because we were doing it also. And I've
Yeah.
learned that there's a name for it and that we do it we do it in different levels. I mean, it happens at the university when we're asking for money
Yep.
and we give the story of from rags to, if the person didn't have this fellowship or this scholarship, they wouldn't be able to go this place or go that place. And I also know that in college admissions, the more traumatic your story is, then the more the university feels a need to admit you. The problem with that is that it often reflects a certain group of people and you can't climb out of that need for help.
Mm.
You're always in need of somebody coming in and helping you. And that comes from the 1940s, after the war, and we were talking about going into those black and brown communities and lifting them because they can't possibly lift themselves. That's where that comes from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we could do
So we
this.
don't help, we support.
Support.
And support is a little more neutral.
Yeah.
And sometimes people do need help and they will ask for help, but we don't perceive what we're doing as helping. In
Yeah.
fact, we give out during our outreach, and I'm still not comfortable with this notion of homeless. I've seen people talk about unhoused, I've seen unsheltered. So I like the fact that we're still wrestling with it, but in the absence of what we don't have, which is language always to name what we need to do, then I don't want to stop it because we're trying to find a name for it. But we offer shoes, toiletries, and clothing.
Mm-hmm.
And before the pandemic, we saw 100 to 150 clients, mostly men, identified as men. And since the pandemic, it has been 200 to 250 biweekly. And we do 2 hours. It's a pop-up market that comes from in-kind donations from our many communities around here. And then some people send us stuff from elsewhere. We have an Amazon wish list. There are
Mm.
all these ways in which people can support. And then you can come down on a Saturday morning. Now we're the third Saturdays of each month. And we set up this pop-up market. And then our clients come through and we are their personal shoppers. And it is one of the most impactful, life-changing things for me personally. There's certain ways, and this will go into feeling. I'll go back to the feeling. I don't have to think about that when I center someone else. I don't have to think about my own stuff, and I can feel the goodness that radiates when somebody is really appreciative of what we are doing.
Mm-hmm.
That's a
Mm-hmm.
feeling,
Yeah.
and that's a feeling that we love to have, but we can't choreograph that in the same way that we can't choreograph an aha moment. All
Yeah.
we can do is put it out there and hope and invite you into a space where you are able to have that if the spirit moves you.
I hope this is an appropriate question to ask. While being of service and supporting
Hmm.
these folks
Hmm.
within the organization that you are with and ASU itself,
Hmm.
are there any conversations around housing and how to support getting folks into a home and house and shelter?
Well, there are conversations. What we do is we supply a resource list. And we are actually talking to people now, and I think it's called Reserve at Thunderbird, about programming that we can bring there for people who are in permanent housing. But we don't necessarily move into a space where we are making a commitment to tell people about how to get into housing.
Hmm.
I'm a firm believer in staying focused, but deeper than trying to do too much.
Hmm.
There are people who have way more resources. Keep in mind, this is a volunteer space.
Hmm.
That it would be different if if this was an assigned job that people had to do, but we just know this is the lane that has worked for us.
Yes.
And sometimes, if it's possible, we can connect with other organizations. I just met with an organization, Sue's Espacios, here with the city of Tempe, as a potential partnership for our outreach as well. And that again is the shoes, clothing, and toiletries, because no matter what else happens, there are certain basic things that people need in order to move to that next level.
Hmm.
So we don't go in, and this is what we have to make sure that we are very conscientious about, is not feeling that we can do it all and save people. There are other organizations who are doing different things, and they are doing those things quite well. And I think there's enough space, unfortunately, in this arena for all of us to do something.
Really important distinction. In addition to owning and operating Phoenix Business RadioX, I'm also a coach
Mhm.
and an accountability partner for
Mhm.
individuals and organizations. And I know my lane. If someone needs a therapist and a licensed counselor, I know that that is a different level and a different opportunity to
Yes.
connect. And I can run in tandem with
Yes.
that professional, as I often have, or I can also hand the baton over
Yes.
and let them run with it.
Yes.
They're right. We all need different levels of support. And I think it's
Yes.
very important for us as leaders to be really clear about our mission, our purpose, and know that we can link arms with other organizations
Yes.
and individuals who
Yes.
can take care of things that may not be in our wheelhouse.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There is no success without collaboration. That's what that hand, you'll see our hand graphic on many things, and it has people sort of moving in a direction. And when we first saw this hand as a graphic, some people thought, well, that looks like the Thanksgiving turkey hand. So we added some more people, and the idea was we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand. And that is loosely borrowed from Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery. So, yeah, it doesn't say we have to be. It doesn't say you can't do anything. But I'm recognizing now what it's like if one of those fingers is somehow not functioning the way it should be. Actually, the real experience is I had toe surgery and about 4 weeks ago, and I didn't realize how dependent I was on my big toe for
Who
balance
knew?
and for a move. Well, somebody knew. The orthopedist knew. I didn't know, and I'm still trying to get in my head that with the physical therapy I can get back to where I was. But again, it shows to me how I need all of those to function. It doesn't mean that you can't function if two of those. It just means my maximum functionality, as I know it to be, is when that toe should be what it should be. And so the separate as the fingers, yet one is the hand. So we can connect people to other organizations, but we don't try to come in there being everything to everybody
Hmm.
and then we're nothing to anybody.
Hmm.
And what I appreciate, which is I think what we add, because the travel size toothpaste, the clothing, the shoes, none of our clients would just fall off the map if they didn't have those things.
Hmm.
But what I do know is that we're providing something that supplements what they can get elsewhere. And that thing that they're not always getting is the human kindness and the humanity. So when
Hmm.
we invite people in, we have rules, we have guidelines, but we also give people choices. Can't tell you the number of times I've seen on social media where somebody, I hope unconsciously, is saying, "Oh, I saw this homeless person outside McDonald's and I went in, bought a hamburger, and then brought it back to them and they didn't want it." And I thought, well, did you ask the person if they wanted that? Or why not take the person in and say, I want to get you something. So there's something about choice. So we set this up as a market. People come in, we tag, size, inventory those things on Friday afternoon up here in the community services building just close to Tempe Town Lake, so that they're in bins, and we take them down and we put them out on tables. We try to make it as dignified as we can, and people have choices. We also don't give people bags. I know there are blessing bags that lots of organizations like to put together, and those are wonderful if we're driving down the street and you see somebody and you want to hand them. But I also know I've been to places where I'd get a swag bag and I'd look through the swag bag and there's stuff like, I don't want that. So we sort of take those bags away when they come, or dismantle them and then put them out individually so people
Can
have
choose.
choices. And it really does it rings, and this is where the feeling part comes in. It really rings differently than having a conversation in a classroom, or even in our conversations where we feel like we've really learned something or been enhanced. When somebody comes up and says, "Thank you.
Mm.
I know that you don't have to be here, but thank you for doing this." And even though it's a huge commitment to do it. It is one of the most transformative things for me to feel that we have somehow made someone's life easier, if only for a moment. And that moment might be acknowledging them, saying, "Good morning. What's your name and what are you looking for this morning?" And just to have a name, and just to have somebody center, as we are the personal shoppers, as the volunteers for 20 minutes. "Oh my gosh, this looks great on you." And watching somebody grab a pair of X and just feeling ecstatic that they have that. That to me that's the feeling part, but we can't choreograph that. At
It's
the
not
end of
fabricated. It can't
it's
be
not
fabricated.
there's something that's so authentic about that it sort of can cancel out for that moment all the other stuff
Mhm.
that we may have been burdened with as we came down.
Hmm.
And it's all around Humanity 101. We call that Humanity 101 in action.
I was just going to ask you about that particular program as it
Yeah.
relates to undergrads.
Yes.
How does that all play out?
Well, it's not we love language. And so Humanity 101 is not a class. It is a series of strategies and programs that link these activities together. So we call it Humanity 101 because it's fundamental to human ties. If we're going to have justice, if we're going to have diversity, if we're going to have all those things, we've got to have these things that are about respect, integrity, compassion, empathy, forgiveness, kindness, respect, and self-reflection.
So
That's
if,
what it is. So it's not about undergraduates. None of our programming is particularly targeted toward any specific group.
okay. So this is not a class I'm going to
It is
sign up
not a
for.
class you're going to sign up for.
However, it's going to be a thread that's woven
It's a
through.
thread that pulls everything. We like to think in this tapestry that we call humanity. That's what it is.
Mm.
And there's a play on it because it's fundamental.
Mhm.
Anything that you're building on needs a foundation, and we think this is the foundation.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a class. I mean, it could be a class, but it wouldn't be called Humanity 101. It would be called Humanities 101.
Mm-hmm.
Humanities is the study of, that's the discipline. That's the thing that you can get a degree in, the thing that you would do in a classroom, the thing that you would do if you were, humanities, because people have also had problems trying to define that.
Mm-hmm.
It's typically language, history, writing, reading, literacy. Those in and of themselves are not absolutes. And I resist this notion when people say, well, humanities teach us how to be critical thinking. Well, I think other things can teach us how to be critical thinkers. But we try to say, well, how are we being humane? And I think that's where these principles come in to frame this. And again, rather than trying to define it, we try to do it and then name it. And from what I know, humans were always doing things before we had a name for it. We didn't name it and then go do it. We did it and said, well, here's what it is. This is feminism. Oh, this is womanism. Oh, this is X. So that's how I, as the leader of this organization, try to sort of frame the conversations that we have.
Mm-hmm. How do our listeners and viewers get involved? Is there room and space to become part of it if we're not necessarily part of the ASU community?
Are you kidding?
I love that ball on purpose.
Are you kidding? Oh my gosh. There is a place for everybody in this initiative. And it recognizes that you don't have to physically be here. We do virtual programs, especially during the pandemic. We started a podcast club, and a podcast club specifically was a discussion, much like a book club and a film club, where people would listen to a podcast that we would select, and then they'd come and have an hour discussion about it. And that has opened us up to so many possibilities nationally and internationally, as did the hackathon. We did that online. Oh my gosh, there were so many moving parts in that, though, that it was exhausting, but it worked, though.
Yeah.
But trying to orchestrate. So, just go to our Project Humanities website. That's the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have volunteer opportunities that go beyond the outreach, but you can always look at all the different parts of that outreach. You can also call us at 480-727-7030, or just email us at projecthumanities at asu.edu. And I am likely the person who will be responding to those. But I do have a wonderful team of people who have challenged me, but also helped me see how we can be better as an organization, both institutionally, but also individually.
Mhm.
There's a place for everybody. And then come to our hackathon in the fall. And if you can't come, to participate, for 36 hours, even though we're going to give you food and snacks and games and raffle, you can mentor for 2 hours or volunteer for 2 hours with the logistics. So there is not one opportunity that you can't create depending on who you are and what you want that volunteer experience to be like.
Yeah, bringing my skill set and also
Yes.
staying open to gaining
Yes.
far more than I'm bringing.
We hope. We
Yes,
hope.
well, that opportunity is there.
Yes.
You mentioned already the website. It's
Yes.
projecthumanities.asu.edu. Can you give us that phone number one more time?
Yes. 480-727-7030. And we are there from 8 to 5. And I'm more often than not answering emails. It's interesting because what's not on that list of things that we have done, the topics is hustle culture. We even talked about that. That hustle culture, which I didn't know it had a name, is one of those things where we can't quite put our phones down or not respond to an email and essentially not take care of ourselves because we're always trying to respond to someone else. And it was interesting having that particular conversation because in order to come to the conversation, one had to put it on the calendar. So, so in an already busy schedule, but that's what makes it radical though, is when you stop and say, this is what I'm going to do for me. And too often the hustle culture is about other people's demands on us and our
Mhm.
commitment to fulfilling which stuff that we don't design.
Yeah.
And so this is a way of, and I'm still learning that. So keep in mind, I am not leading an organization that I know everything about except how it started. But in terms of the topics that we choose, I like these in the same way that I teach classes that I want to learn about. When I started the N word class back in 2008, I wanted to know how that word was still being so commonly used around then Senator Barack Obama. So rather than try to read a book, I said, I'll create a class around it. Same thing with children's literature. Same things with the race and gender politics of hair. I'll see something curious and I'll say, I want to study along with my students. And I
Mhm.
create the class. So I have the luxury of doing that.
Mhm. There's something very special about you. I'm
Thank you.
I'm just very intrigued. You're hitting all the high notes for me as I get to know professionals and even just in my people in my personal life. There's this thread of curiosity. There's this thread of what I call soulful self reliance, where you are really accountable to yourself, what you're saying out loud, and how it's showing up for you in your body and your spirit. I just am so thrilled, Randy. Thank you, Randy. It's been a joy to get to know you. How did you land in academia, even to begin with? Like, tell
Mm,
us about Neal the early years.
okay. Well, I grew up in a small town in Georgia, close to Athens, Georgia. I was sort of integrated during that time that desegregation started. And I went into the white schools from my black community and didn't quite understand why we were having to go to a different school. Nobody
Mhm,
asked us. My family never talked about race relations per se.
mhm,
Wasn't a family of professionals, but it was a family of decent people though, and decent people. I'm learning now who knew their places. So I think eh, because I had a strong church family that was not just interested in our spiritual growth and development, but also very, very focused on education. So it was not an option that we're going to go off the people who went to this segregated black church off to college someplace. Now, that in and of itself is a bias because there are vocational things, but churches have been showered by the same kinds of things that other institutions have. But for me, it went to moving into those predominantly white spaces and often being an only in those white spaces. And then going off to college at the University of Georgia system called West Georgia College, that is now the University of West Georgia. And then being sort of kind of serendipitously admitted to Vanderbilt University, where again, I was one of few African Americans who was in my graduating class. And the first, as I understand it, English PhD person of color there, black person.
Hmm.
And so the first job was at the University of Alabama with a short stint at another liberal arts college called University of Montevallo. And then I started teaching African American literature, even though my degree was in English and I could teach Tennessee Williams, I could teach Washington Irving, I could teach William Faulkner, but my white colleagues were teaching those. What they were not teaching was Ornell Hurston or Ntozake Shange or Adrienne Kennedy or Langston Hughes in the way I wanted to teach it. And so I stuck with that, and that has created a space that is not often experienced by Black male professors who do children's literature, but also who do that primarily through the lens of feminist scholarship. So most of my writing is on Black women. My books are on Black women. I grew up in a household full of strong Black women. And so I think that's where a lot of my perspectives come from and a lot of my synergies, but a lot of my lessons come from writing about children and women and not speaking for, but trying to be the best ally I can with.
Mm. You have a edited volume of Social Justice and Action
Yes.
Models for Campus and Community coming
Yes.
out.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about
Yes,
that.
I'm so excited about this because it has taken forever to get it done.
Mhm.
And I mean forever as in we started this before the pandemic. And then once the pandemic started, everything slowed down.
Mhm.
And the pandemic and George Floyd's murder had to be integrated once those initial 19 people had written their pieces. So there's been this constant back and forth. Trying to work with 19 other contributors has been both rewarding but also challenging in terms of meeting deadlines. But I also had some challenges just in the volume itself because I wanted this volume to be different than anything else that had been published by this professional organization. And it was also part of my trying to write down my journey of trying to understand what justice is.
Hmm.
And what I discovered is I don't know what justice is because we have not, as a society, from my perspective, witnessed justice for all. There's justice for some, depending on the skin color, depending on your gender, depending on your sexual identity, depending on your class. And so, what's easier for me to do, and I conclude this in the book, is to acknowledge what injustice is and address that,
Mm.
and to continue to work towards something that is more just. And I have 19 different perspectives in there that could not have been a perspective I could have done as a single author. Everything from there's an actor, Harry Lennox, who was in Blacklist and also Matrix Reloaded, who writes about what it's like to be an actor on the screen and the stage and also be an activist, because those don't always seem to match. And he goes through an interesting personal story about how he has to somehow manage his own activism when he's taking on a role and the consequences that that can have for those who are out there being an activist and making social justice pronouncements, but also wanting a job. We also have an architect in there who is writing about buildings and the ways in which buildings do or do not, mostly do not, reflect justice issues. Everything from the boarding schools for indigenous children to Jim Crow laws that separated people.
Mhm.
All of that was based on a certain kind of physical architecture. We also have essays in there about higher education is being oversold to underrepresented groups. And that resonated with me on a whole lot of levels. And there's an essay on Project Humanities. There's another one on as a community engagement model, but there's another one on meditation within prisons, how that is itself a radical act. There's a conversation about museums and libraries being social justice spaces. So the idea is how do I get as many different voices in there that can talk about different ways of doing and engaging social justice work without virtue signaling, but also talking about the pitfalls of doing that work. And what's sad to me is, and I know that sadness sometimes people rest in that; it doesn't move you.
Mhm.
But what's frustrating and sad is that I've got voices in there of people who have been doing this work for as long as I've been alive, and they're still talking about the same challenges.
Mhm. Mhm.
Jane Elliott, for example, who did the brown eye, blue eye test back in 1968. She's the white woman, and we said little white woman who just created a stir when she had those third graders do the blue eyed, brown eye test, which was the arbitrariness of power and privilege. And she's still doing that. And it was a response to Dr. King's assassination, and her white kids in Iowa wanted to know, well, why did people do that? And she tried to explain racism through this. Okay, today we're going to pull all the blue eyed children together, and you're going to be able to do X, Y, and Z. You're going to go to the bathroom first. You're going to do this first. You're going to do this. And then the next day, it was the brown eyed people. And she watched them, the kids now, third graders, based on this sort of arbitrariness of eye color. And I'm excited about those because they offer perspectives that I, as a single author, couldn't do.
Mhm.
And it's a way of sort of challenging this notion, first of all, of what humanities is, because that was one of the reviewers' comments is, well, how is this humanities? How is this a teaching?
How is it
So
not?
there was the question, though. But part of that is because we couldn't get unshackled from the ways things have always been.
Mhm.
And so, one of the reviewers, also anonymous reviewer, said, this is a book that this organization needs to look at as a mirror to sort of address some of its own concerns. And so from the very beginning of that, it was just one constant sort of having to justify and explain why I was writing this volume as was. And even up to the last copy editing, I had to remind a copy editor that interpreting my argument was not copy editing. And to tell me, as a Black person in this country who has been studying Black folks for a long time, that maybe we should call the Negro National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, the Black National Anthem, was insulting, because that was not what it was called when it was written by those two Johnson brothers. It was not called the Black. And that has a whole different connotation when we talk about the Negro National Anthem versus a Black national anthem. And so those kinds of things were interesting, but it showed me again how there's still gatekeeping, and that for some of us who are doing the work, it can be still kind of treacherous. And I did mention, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this also, for engaging in the social justice work. I've also had some recently, some 2 years ago, some interesting backlash for naming white supremacy, the illusion of it, and systemic racism. So much so that I, to this day, still get some very, very disturbing emails
Mhm.
that's hate mail. And a couple of those have kind of flirted with death threats for naming social justice work. So times have changed. I don't know that this would have been the case 8 years ago, because I'm doing the same sort of stuff that I was doing before. It is not it's not to be provocative. It is to sort of name
Mhm.
things in ways that don't necessarily sugarcoat them,
Mhm.
but call them out, call them in. But there are people who don't want to hear that. And if you put that in the context of the present political system, context of legislation being used to essentially whitewash or silence any conversations about U.S. history, then the work that Project Humanities is doing, and the work that I am trying to do as a researcher, is critical to our evolution.
Beautiful place to pause and to offer my gratitude for you spending time with us this morning. I have been keeping this list of folks that I know very personally, and folks who have been as guests on my show that I want to make introductions to.
Oh, thank you.
This is a beautiful example of why we do what we do here at Business Radio X. So thank you again. I feel very fortunate to have had a chance to spend time with you this morning. Again, you've been listening to Phoenix Business Radio, broadcasting from the Max 6 Entrepreneurial Center. We've had the privilege of connecting with Neal Lester, who is the Foundation Professor of English and Founding Director of Project Humanities at Arizona State University. You can stay in touch with all that's happening and get involved, encouraging you to get directly involved, no matter where you are in the world, at projecthumanities.asu.edu. Some media leans left, some lean right, and we lean humanities. Next time, I'll be with you again. Thanks for listening.